Greetings and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, Executive Editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today, as he does every week, is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. We are recording this on Friday, July 14th. Casey, still a lot of stuff going on with the border crisis. Senate Republicans this week turned up the heat on President Joe Biden, essentially saying he has created the largest child trafficking ring in U.S. history. Now, is that pretty much political hyperbole? Is there some truth to that? Help us out here.
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, making it personal, laying it explicitly only at President Biden's feet is probably a little bit of hyperbole because this is a problem that's been building for years across several administrations. A lot of people have been reporting on it. We've been reporting on it at thecentersquare.com that this problem has been going. But it's definitely true that under the Biden administration, this problem has gotten much, much worse. And in particular, the child trafficking element has gotten worse. And I want to address something you said in your opening before we dive into this, which is you called it a border crisis, Dan. Now, some of our listeners might be tempted to say it's politicizing it to call it a crisis, but actually Gallup just released polling, I think it was today or maybe it was yesterday, but I believe it was this morning, that showed the majority of Americans, regardless of how they want to address the problem and where they fall politically, think that we are definitely in a crisis at the southern border. So this has become pretty much a bipartisan fact that the southern border is in crisis. And I think that's important to note that your average American, regardless of what they think about what we need to do, think that what we're doing now is not working. And you laid out some of the reasons for that. I can give a few facts to kick us off. This is reporting from different places like an Axios did an investigation, but, initial reports showed that there are more than 45,000 children. The Axios looked at just a few months in early 2022, and they found 45,000 missing children. Since they did that number has more than doubled. So we're not talking about a few hundred, every day, maybe, every week, one or two kids. We're talking about tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of kids since Biden took office, right? And unaccompanied minors have been a huge problem, using falsified paperwork, coming over here for work. If somebody comes over, especially if they're a teenager and they're not accompanied, there's no real way to know if they don't have the paperwork to verify their age, right? So you could easily have like a 15, 16-year-old kid come across the border and we don't even know, and they say they're 19. I mean, how can we disprove that, right? So because of the lack of paperwork, and then also, and I'll hand it back to you after this, the worst part of this is how many people are being taken advantage of by the cartels, by kind of corrupt coyotes. The cartels are more brutal and take advantage of people, but coyotes might lie to you and say, hey, you pay me, this amount of money, I'll get you over there. And then they separate them, they sell the kids into trafficking, and then they take the money and run or something, right? So people are very vulnerable when they come across.
Yeah, so just to emphasize your point, there's been at least 85,000 children who crossed the border under the Biden administration, just two and a half years, that are now missing.
And those are the ones we know about.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows how many that actual number is, because under Biden administration policies, there have been more than 8 million encounters at the border in 2.5 years since January 2021. Biden's administration ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which essentially meant migrants who seek to cross the border, who have crossed the border for humanitarian reasons and are seeking asylum in this country. Under the Trump administration, they were sent back to Mexico as their asylum cases were heard in U.S. courts. That's not the case anymore. Under the Biden administration, they cross the border, they apply for asylum, and they're released into the United States until their hearing. And those hearings sometimes are scheduled 3 and 4 years down the road. Well, who's gonna show up to a hearing 3 or 4 years later? You're going to disappear into the country. And when it comes to these underage children, as you said, the cartels, essentially, it's like modern day slavery. They agree to help people cross the border, including unaccompanied minors, and those people are indebted to the cartels for getting them into the United States. So they have to work. Some are put into the sex business to pay off those debts to the cartels. And the Biden administration has also created significantly easier ways for migrants who want to get into the U.S. to do so by this app that they created. Essentially, migrants who want to cross the border and stay in the United States apply through this app. They go to a point of entry in the country. They're processed by Border Patrol, and then they're allowed in the country on their own. And, I understand there are certain humanitarian concerns for many of these folks who are fleeing radical countries, oppressive countries. But at what point U.S. taxpayers are, of course, on the hook for these millions of people who have crossed the border since the Biden administration, and what happens with them? I mean, that's what we don't know, particularly when we're talking about these 85,000 children the federal government lost track of.
Yeah, it's really, really sad. And I just want to point out that these are not some kind of, right-wing conspiracy reports. I mean, I referenced Axios, which is a mainstream left, definitely liberal paper. The New York Times has reported on this at length about the unaccompanied minors and them being placed with human traffickers and how they're being exploited. And this is a quote, and quote, brutal jobs across the U.S. Right, so that's the New York Times. So this isn't some, anti-immigrant conspiracy. It's really a sad situation. And as the Gallup poll showed, what Americans would call a crisis. And it's not surprising. We know from history and from other things that have happened around the world, anytime you have mass migration and anytime you have a refugee crisis, right, there are many, many people who are exploited, who are taken advantage of, who are trafficked, children go missing. It happens every time. And so the way that we have left kind of a power vacuum, the way that the federal government has stepped back so much at the border, pulled back, we don't track down people and deport them. If they have a really bad criminal record, we might go after them, but even then, not all the time, because there's not really a wall that's securing everything. There's a power vacuum at the southern border, and it's being filled by the cartels. It's being filled by traffickers. Anytime there's this much money and this many people, someone is going to, take control and govern that area. And because, the U.S. and Mexican government aren't really governing it, it's being left open to those who want to take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, and just one final point. Border Patrol agents, since President Biden took office, have apprehended more than 300 known or suspected terrorists trying to get into the country illegally. And that's just the ones they apprehended. There are plenty. U.S. Border Patrol uses the phrase gotaways, those who are spotted, whether it's through drones or satellite or even eyes, illegally crossing the border, who they are unable to apprehend, who make their way into the U.S. There's hundreds of thousands of those people that we just don't know who they are, and they've made their way into the country. With more than 300 apprehended, suspected, known or suspected terrorists being apprehended, who knows how many of those gotaways are on that same watch list.
Yeah, that's right. I think my big takeaway from this reporting is, many people who want to open the border want to do that in the name of compassion. The way things are being handled right now, there's nothing compassionate about it. People aren't being left better off by the way that the trafficking, especially of children, is happening. So Gallup shows Americans think it's a crisis. The data shows that children are being trafficked en masse because of the kind of anarchy down there. And as you said, with the gotaways, we really don't even know how bad the problem is. We only know about the people, Border Patrol agents see that get away. And we don't even know the scope of the problem of those who are never detected.
Well, we'll leave it at that this week, Casey, because we are out of time. But at the Center Square, we have comprehensive coverage of the border crisis, and I will use the word crisis because of what we just talked about. Readers can keep up with our ongoing border crisis coverage at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe.